Greetings, dear friends, fellow programmers, and those aspiring to be. Boy, do I have an exciting video for you today, because today we will learn two techniques that are going to improve your database understanding and performance of your database communication in the application substantially. I'm talking about AsTracking and AsNoTracking methods provided by Entity Framework. So in this video, we'll be diving into these methods, learn what are their benefits and drawbacks, and basically become informed enough to make a very good decision when to use which of those two methods in order to get the most benefits and prevent any unwanted behaviors from happening. First, let's talk about AsTracking method. So this is a default method for Entity Framework. Entity Framework uses AsTracking as its default behavior. It means that when it fetches entities from the database, it will track their state, so it will listen for any modifications on any of the values of any of the properties that are assigned to the entities fetched from the database. And if any changes were to take place the first time you invoke SaveChanges async method on your DB context, changes to all of these properties will be propagated to the database by creating update statements that are going to be executed against the database. Now, before we take a deep dive into this concept, I want you to listen very carefully once again, because it's very important to know that AsTracking is the default method when using Entity Framework to fetch data. So by default, Entity Framework is going to track changes on all the properties of all the entities that were fetched from the database and not explicitly stated that you do not want it to track changes on those entities and properties. So be very aware of that fact, because if you are not, you might very easily end up in a very tough situations. Now, when we got that out of the way, let's discuss what is going to be happening when using AsTracking. So, as its name suggests, Entity Framework will track all the changes on all the entities and their respective properties throughout the entire lifetime of your application. When you change values of any of the properties, their values will be noticed by Entity Framework, and it will remember that their state was modified. It will flag the states of those properties to modified state, and the first time you invoke SaveChanges async, it will create update query to propagate those changes into the database and save them. This, of course, reflects on the fact that some hardware resources, both memory and CPU, are going to be dedicated to Entity Framework, having to track all of those things. So basically, the performance of your application is going to be reduced. There will be a slight downgrade when it comes to speed of your application if you want Entity Framework to track changes when compared to scenario when you do not want it to track changes. Now that we understand that part, let's jump right to our Visual Studio and discuss it in action. So, as you can see here, we have a very simple update customer name async method, which fetches customers from the database, and then if the customer is not null, it will assign a new name and then invoke SaveChanges async method on our DB context. As you can see right here, I did not specify that I want explicitly Entity Framework to track changes on our customer, but let us see what is going to happen when I run this code. And yes, here we go. So we're first fetching the customer, where the ID is the ID we provided as a parameter, which is perfectly fine. Basically, when this line right here gets executed, the changes that were created on the name of our customers are going to be propagated to the database. So Entity Framework has noticed that the value of the name property for our customer has changed, and it updated the status of that property to changed or modified if you want to be 100% exact, and then it will generate this script for updating the value in the database. And right now, our name should be updated and propagated in the database. And just again, be very aware of the fact that this was without me explicitly specifying AsTracking, and it still did propagate to the database. If I added this, it would be the same. And do not get me wrong, this is an amazing feature because it will allow you not to worry about all the updates on your entities being propagated and properly stored in the database when you want them to be. So you will not have to create explicit methods for updating values and storing them in the database. Entity Framework can do that for you. But you have to be very careful about the side effects of this method. So when you have the understanding, you will have the control and you will just benefit from them. You will never have issues because you know what is going to cause them. So now I think is as good moment as any to also address AsNoTracking method. And this method is going to do everything exactly the same as the AsTracking method, with the sole difference that Entity Framework is not going to care about the changes that are happening on the properties of all the entities it fetched from the database. It will save resources because it will not invest resources into allowing Entity Framework to track those changes, and it will not update the database unless you explicitly state that you want some changes to be introduced. It will not do it automatically for you, as was the case with AsTracking scenario. To be sure and show you how it works in action, I just think we could jump into Visual Studio again, and I will show you. So this right here is our new method, which is going to show us how AsNoTracking works. As you can see right here, we have exactly the same scenario. We again receive customer ID and customer name, and then we fetch the customer from the database by the ID, as was the case in the first scenario, and then we update the name and invoke SaveChangesAsync method. But let's see what is going to be happening in this scenario. As you can see right here, we have only a single query getting executed. We are just fetching the customer from the database, and we are not updating anything. That is because Entity Framework has not marked properties of our customer into modified state, which will again make Entity Framework not care and not save any updates in the database, which is again exactly what we expected to see here. And what I want you to take a look at is this execution time right here. It's 200 milliseconds. Now, let me again run the first scenario with AsTracking method, and let's see what is going to be the difference. And here we go. As you can see, we have 250 milliseconds. So it's a 25% difference in performance. That is not a small difference at all. Just imagine this with huge sets of data being compiled, executed, fetched, populated into memory, and everything else, when you have AsTracking and AsNoTracking included properly. So have that in mind. And basically that's it. Right now, you should understand the concept of AsTracking and AsNoTracking methods provided by Entity Framework. I hope you enjoyed the video, and of course if you did, I would like to kindly invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss another of these fun and educational videos in the future. Until the next time, thank you for watching and happy coding!